They said it wasn't normal. That woman is doing something to them. Look at those girls, sleeping like nothing ever happened. That's not natural. The accusation echoed through the marble halls of the Butler estate like a bullet. For the first time in 6 unbearable months, Anna and Anne, 4-year-old twins haunted by their mother's tragic death, were asleep before 9 p.m. Not screaming, not sobbing, not hiding under the bed, just asleep. And someone in that house wanted answers, or maybe they wanted control. Thomas, the family's long-serving head butler, stood rigid by the nursery door, his voice low but laced with the kind of sharp suspicion that doesn't ask for proof, it demands it. She's too quiet, too calm, I'm telling you, Mr. Butler, she's hiding something. Across the room, Julia Glover sat beside the twins' beds, not touching, not speaking, just watching with a stillness that unsettled the staff more than any tantrum ever could. She looked in control, and that made her dangerous. Edward Butler stood at the threshold of the nursery, motionless, a billionaire who could buy peace but not sleep, not for himself and certainly not for his daughters. And now, here it was. Peace. As Anna stirred gently beneath a blue-striped blanket, and Anne snuggled closer to the plush toy gripped in her small hand, Edward felt a flicker of something he hadn't known in months. Hope. But that flicker was instantly dimmed by doubt, because the calm in that room was setting the rest of the house on edge. "If you really want to know what I do at night," Julia said without turning around, "you should check the nursery cameras." Her voice was soft, controlled, and chilling in its certainty. The room went silent. A guilty person wouldn't suggest surveillance, but Julia didn't flinch. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't defend herself. Because Julia Glover wasn't there to defend, she was there to protect. And what no one in that house knew, what even Edward hadn't begun to suspect, was that Julia didn't come from a MAID agency. She came with a mission, one rooted in a past she never talks about, one that's about to shake the entire Butler estate to its core. But before we begin, click subscribe, like this video, and tell us where in the world you're watching from. I hope this video makes you believe kindness comes from the heart. That maid is doing something to the children. Look at them, completely still. It's unnatural. The words came out low, almost whispered, but in the quiet hush of the nursery hallway they cut like glass. Thomas stood like a statue beside Edward Butler, arms folded, jaw tight, eyes locked on the 2 small beds bathed in warm lamplight. Inside, Anna and Anne were fast asleep, one curled into a star-patterned blanket, the other holding tightly to a soft rabbit. For the first time since the night their mother died, the house wasn't filled with crying, or pleading, or the sound of little feet pacing the floors until morning, just the soft, even rhythm of sleep. And in the center of it all, Julia Glover. She didn't speak, didn't react, just turned her gaze slowly toward Thomas, eyes unreadable, calm as ever. "You think that's suspicious?" she asked softly. "2 children sleeping through the night." Thomas narrowed his eyes. "Not when it happens naturally." Julia stood, smoothed her apron, walked past them both like she wasn't being accused of something unspeakable, and then, without breaking stride, she turned back. "If you're that concerned," she said, "check the nursery cameras." The silence that followed was crushing. Edward blinked. He hadn't even remembered there were cameras. A guilty person wouldn't ask for surveillance, but Julia had volunteered it. Calm, controlled, like a woman with nothing to hide, and maybe far more to reveal. He looked at her differently then. Not just as the woman who'd somehow done the impossible, but as someone carrying something heavy and unspoken. "Why did you take this job?" he asked quietly. Julia met his eyes. "Because someone in this house is hurting your daughters, Mr. Butler. And it's not me." She walked away, leaving Edward stunned, and Thomas shaken. He didn't know it yet, but that was the last night silence would mean peace. From now on, silence would mean something else entirely. She arrived without a resume, no long list of glowing references, no polished letter from any polished agency, just a navy suitcase, a pressed uniform, and a calmness that unnerved nearly everyone she met. Julia Glover stepped onto the Butler estate like she'd been there before, like the air already knew her name. The twins had been screaming that afternoon. Again, a puzzle of panic and grief no one had solved in months, but the moment Julia crossed the threshold, they stopped. Edward had watched from the upstairs landing, exhausted, worn down, skeptical. 5 nannies had come and gone. 2 hadn't even lasted a full day. But Julia hadn't flinched when Anna threw a stuffed bear at her chest. She'd simply knelt to eye level. "You're safe now," she said. Just that. No baby talk, no patronizing smile. And the girls listened. Not because they were told to, but because something in Julia's voice sounded like a truth they hadn't heard in a long time. By the second night, they were sleeping longer. By the third, they were smiling. But downstairs, the staff had begun whispering. Julia didn't make small talk. She didn't join in the gossip. She read dense books about trauma science in the kitchen between shifts, and once Thomas swore he heard her singing to the girls in a language he didn't recognize. "It's not natural," he muttered. "No one's that calm." But calm wasn't what made Julia dangerous. It was what she noticed. She noticed Anne flinch every time a door slammed. She noticed Anna rub her wrist when Thomas entered the room. And late at night, when the house was quiet and everyone believed the crisis was over, Julia sat by the girls' door, writing. Page after page in a worn leather notebook, recording patterns, nightmares, words unsaid. "Almost there," she whispered to herself one night. "Just a little longer, girls, just a little longer." Edward hadn't meant to eavesdrop. He was just passing the nursery on his way to his office. Another restless night, another unopened bottle of scotch in his hand. But then he heard it. A lullaby, low, gentle, sung in a language he couldn't place. He paused at the door. Inside, Julia sat cross-legged on the rug between the twins' beds, her hands resting softly on her knees, her eyes closed as her voice rose and fell in slow, melodic waves. The room smelled faintly of lavender. Weighted blankets tucked neatly around 2 tiny bodies. Anne's hand was curled beneath her cheek. Anna's lips barely moved as she whispered along to the final line. And then silence. Not the kind Edward had grown used to, the brittle, waiting for the next scream kind. This silence felt different, full, whole, and terrifying. What language was that? His voice surprised even himself. He hadn't planned to speak. Julia opened her eyes but didn't look up. "Gullah," she said quietly. "It's old, from the Sea Islands. My grandmother's tongue." Edward stepped inside, slowly. "Why use it here?" She finally looked at him. "Because it's not just a lullaby," she said. "It's a memory. One that tells the body it's safe to rest, even when the world outside doesn't make sense." He didn't know what to say, so he just stood there, feeling like a stranger in his own home. Downstairs, Thomas watched the nursery feed from the kitchen monitor. He saw Julia rock gently, saw the girls fall into sleep with unnatural ease. And as the lullaby played through the faint speaker, unfamiliar, haunting, beautiful, something sharp flickered behind his eyes. "She's casting spells now," he muttered under his breath. "You'll see." But Julia wasn't casting spells. She was unlocking grief, and the ghosts that lived inside those girls were finally starting to listen. The file was thick. A manila envelope with no return address slipped into Edward Butler's briefcase by Thomas with a single sentence. "You should know who you've brought into this house." Edward opened it alone, long after the twins had fallen asleep, long after Julia's lullaby had faded into silence. He expected lies, a criminal record, a trail of dishonesty. What he found instead made his hands go still. A degree from Howard University, double major, child development and trauma psychology, letters of commendation, research papers, a glowing feature in a Baltimore youth trauma initiative, photos of her at conferences, her in a lab coat, her holding the hand of a crying child with the same calm she carried into his home. Julia Glover wasn't a maid, she was an expert. The next morning, he waited for her in the study, coffee growing cold beside him, her file on the table open, unhidden. When she entered, he didn't raise his voice. "Why didn't you tell me?" Julia looked at the folder, then at him. Not startled, not ashamed. "Would you have hired me if I had?" Edward didn't answer. "People don't want truth when it comes in the wrong uniform," she said. "They want comfort, a role, something that makes sense in their world." He studied her. "But you could be in a hospital, a clinic, anywhere." "I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be," she replied. "Because someone in this house is bleeding." Her voice cracked slightly on the last word, but only for a moment. That night, Edward stared at his daughters across the dinner table, and for the first time he realized it wasn't just that Julia knew how to help them. It was that she already knew what they'd been through, not because she was told, but because she'd seen it before. Thomas had waited long enough. He watched Edward soften, watched the girls laugh again, watched Julia move through the house like she belonged, and something in him snapped. "She's manipulating you," he said, voice tight as he placed a flash drive on Edward's desk. "Watch it. You'll see for yourself." The footage was clipped, roughly edited. Julia sitting close to the girls in the nursery, her hand resting on Anne's back, her lips moving in near silence. A pause, a frame jump, then the twins falling asleep as if under a spell. "I don't know what that is," Thomas said, "but it isn't normal." Edward said nothing, but his jaw tightened. That night, Julia entered the study without being called. She'd seen the change in Edward's eyes. "You saw it?" she asked. He nodded slowly. "Then let me show you mine." She handed him a second flash drive. Smaller, unlabeled. He clicked play. Thomas, in the nursery, standing over Anne's bed as she whimpered, half awake, soaked in fear and shame. "You're a big girl," his voice snapped. "Stop acting like a baby." His tone wasn't angry. It was cold, calculated. Anne flinched, covered her ears. "Disgusting," he muttered. "Your mother would be ashamed." The video ended. Edward leaned back slowly, the weight of it all pressing into his spine. "You think your wife's accident was the end of your problems," Julia said quietly. "But it was only the beginning of what broke those girls." Edward looked at her, anger rising. "That's not your place." "It became my place," she said, the day they started whispering the same cruel things to each other during pretend play. Her voice didn't rise, but something in it burned. And Edward, silent, ashamed, undone, didn't tell her to leave. He couldn't, because for the first time, he saw who'd really been protecting his children, and who hadn't. Her picture still hung in the hallway. Rachel Butler, smiling in soft light, wind in her hair, one twin on each hip. The staff passed it every day, but no one spoke her name. Julia stood in front of it one morning, quiet, her eyes scanning every line of the woman's face. She didn't need to ask about Rachel. She already knew the weight she left behind. That evening, Edward found Julia folding blankets in the nursery. "What exactly are you trying to do here?" he asked, voice tight. She didn't look up. "Heal them," she said, "from the things you won't talk about. You don't know me. I don't need to." She turned to face him now, slow and steady. "I know the silence, the slammed doors, the way Anne flinches when a man raises his voice, the way Anna shrinks when someone says the word boat." Edward stiffened. "That's not your place." "It became my place the day your daughters started playing out the fight you had with your wife before she left." The room held its breath. Later that night, Edward found himself in his study staring at an old voicemail, Rachel's voice, soft, cracking. "I don't like what this house is doing to them, Ed. It's cold. It's cruel. I can't breathe here anymore." Then silence, then the last words she ever said to him. "If something happens to me, please, don't let them grow up this way." Edward sat in the dark long after the message ended. Because deep down, he knew. The house didn't fall apart when Rachel died. It had started crumbling long before. She laid it on his desk like a confession. A simple blue folder, worn at the edges. No label, no warning, just truth. Neatly organized, carefully timed. You should read everything inside before you decide who to trust, Julia said quietly. Edward hesitated, then opened the cover. Inside, incident reports, handwritten notes, photos, a log of whispered cruelties directed at his daughters by the people who were paid to protect them. A page dated 2 months prior. Anne wet the bed, no comfort offered. Staff removed toy as punishment. A photo of Anna's broken bracelet, the one she said she lost. A still frame from the hallway cam, Thomas jerking the door open as the girls huddled behind it. Edward read in silence, shame moving slowly across his face like a shadow he couldn't wipe away. I didn't come here to clean your floors, Julia said. I came to stop the bleeding. She paused, then placed one more envelope beside the folder. That one's mine. He opened it gently. A hospital form, a birth certificate, and a death notice. Malik Isaiah Glover, age 4, asthma attack, negligence suspected. No legal action pursued. He died during recess, she said, eyes fixed on the fire behind him. His teacher said he was exaggerating, ignored his inhaler. By the time I got to the school, he was gone. Her voice didn't break, it didn't need to. The ache lived in every syllable. Since then, all I've tried to do is make sure no child has to scream for help in a room full of adults who pretend not to hear. Edward couldn't speak. He just stared at her, this woman he'd hired to sweep up crumbs, realizing she had come to sweep out ghosts. The silence in the dining room wasn't peaceful. It was the kind that comes just before a storm. Thomas stood at the head of the table, shoulders squared, voice firm. This staff has kept this house running for over 20 years, sir. And now she, that woman, is unraveling it. The other senior staff nodded, tense, rigid. She's not a maid, he said. She's manipulating you. And soon it'll cost you more than sleep. Julia stepped forward without invitation. No raised voice, no need. Before you finish that sentence, I'd like to play something. She pulled her phone from her pocket. Tapped once. The audio filled the room. Thomas. Again. You're filthy. You want to act like a baby? Fine. No dinner. Cry yourself to sleep like you always do. Anne's small voice, trembling. I'm sorry. Edward closed his eyes, just for a second, then stood. You're fired. Thomas froze. You don't mean that. Edward didn't waver. I meant it the second I heard her apologize to the man who made her feel worthless. 2 others followed that day. Quiet exits. No goodbyes. Edward shut the door behind them himself, then turned to Julia. Stay, he said. Not as staff, as whatever you need to be. For them. She looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. Then let's start over. No more pretending grief is something you bury with a body. You're not just their provider, Edward. You're their father. His throat tightened, not because she was right, but because somewhere, deep down, he'd always known it. And just like that, the house began to breathe again. But healing? Healing still had one more storm to survive. Laughter echoed through the halls, where whispers once lived. The Butler estate no longer felt like a museum of grief. It felt alive. Edward had stepped away from his company, not for a crisis, for healing. He spent mornings packing lunchboxes, tying shoes, walking his daughters to school. Some days they held his hand like they were still afraid he'd disappear. But most days they ran ahead, smiling, free. Anna drew pictures again. Anne started sleeping with the light off. No more screaming, no more night terrors. Just 2 little girls learning that peace wasn't temporary. Julia ran the new foundation from a modest office above the garden. Child grief, trauma recovery. The sign on the door read, The Rachel Initiative. Julia never asked Edward to name it after his wife. He just did, because he finally understood what love looked like when it came from protection, not performance. Friday nights were sacred now. Montessori art projects, too much spaghetti, laughter that spilled onto the porch, and always, Julia, not in uniform, just family. One night, as the girls curled up in her lap, Anne whispered, Do you think Mommy would be proud of us?" Julia held her close, steady as ever. "So proud, baby, so proud." Edward watched from the doorway, hands in his pockets, not as the man who ran an empire, but the man who almost lost everything, until a woman with nothing walked in and gave them everything. Julia Glover didn't perform a miracle. She listened, she stayed, and in a world that expected her to serve, she healed.